Today we're diving into a really difficult subject, drawn from our material. It's the disturbing intersection of ageism, sexism, poverty, and traditional beliefs that fuels witchcraft accusations against older women. We're looking particularly at parts of sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Tanzania and Ghana. And it's a crisis that tragically leads to violence, exile, and even death.
It really is. It's one of the most egregious, yet often quite overlooked human rights disasters happening today. The complexity is it's overwhelming. You've got this combination of deep-seated misogyny, profound economic insecurity, and also, critically, a failure of state protection.
Exactly. And our material, it identifies these multiple compounding drivers. But the thing is, when resources are limited and lives are actually at stake, we have to figure out the most effective point of intervention. So the central question for our debate today is really one of priority. Is the core driver here the deep-seated, the literal belief in the supernatural, and does that mean we need solutions focused on cultural and educational shifts?
Right.
Or is the label witch primarily a kind of weaponized justification, something used for material violence and theft, demanding immediate legal and structural reforms?
And that's the crux. I think we must target the belief system first. It's the foundational vulnerability, really, that allows the entire mechanism of violence to even function.
See, I'm going to argue slightly differently. I'll argue that the most impactful intervention has to prioritize legal enforcement and economic empowerment. Because from my reading, the accusations are fundamentally strategic tools. They're used to facilitate material gain, property inheritance, or sometimes just removing someone seen as a burden. We have to dismantle that structural incentive first.
And I'm going to argue that those cultural and educational shifts are the absolutely necessary precursor. The acceptance, the efficacy of the violence, it relies entirely on that literal, deep-seated, supernatural belief within the community. Without challenging that whole conceptual framework, legal reforms, they'll simply be ignored or undermined on the ground.
Okay, so let me lay out my position more fully. My core argument is that this practice, even though it's cloaked in spiritual language, is fundamentally an issue of structural injustice and, frankly, economic opportunism. The label witch, it's a calculated weapon. It's used to justify violence and, crucially, theft. Just consider the evidence we have from Tanzania, where the outcomes are often deadly. The pattern is highly strategic. These accusations, they're rarely just random acts of spiritual fear. They are fueled by measurable problems like poverty, economic envy, and, this is critical, inheritance disputes. Situations where relatives can seize land and assets from vulnerable widows, women who often lack male protection or clear land titles. The research suggests accusations spike after some kind of economic misfortune, like a failed harvest. It provides the perfect cover, you see, for a strategic land grab. And the lack of legal protection transforms this strategy into an epidemic. When a community knows they can beat, kill, or exile an older woman, and the chances of police investigation or prosecution are basically zero, which is the situation in Tanzania where hundreds of murders are documented annually and very rarely investigated, well, then the accusation becomes a highly effective, very low-risk tool for material benefit. Therefore, the state absolutely has to prioritize defining these acts explicitly as gender-based violence. It needs to ensure aggressive investigation of all related crimes and implement economic policies, like clear land titling for women, to really remove the incentive structure for their persecution.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the economic mechanism, and the profit motive certainly escalates the violence, no question. But I would frame the core vulnerability differently. The severity, the persistence of this violence, it relies on the initial designation of the victim. And that designation is entirely reliant on genuine, deep-seated belief systems. Without addressing the root beliefs that validate the accusation in the first place, the economic opportunists, well, they'll just find new justifications, won't they? I come at it from a slightly different angle. The material details how specific, often quite natural, physical changes in aging women are perceived as literal, irrefutable supernatural evidence. Wrinkled skin, red eyes, which, as the source notes, are often simply caused by chronic exposure to smoky cooking fires, or even physiological changes following menopause. these are interpreted as unnatural signs of malevolence. And most tragically, age-related cognitive illnesses like dementia, characterized by memory loss or erratic behavior, they're immediately misinterpreted as definitive signs of witchcraft. Why? Because scientific explanations are entirely absent in many of these communities. You can't prosecute someone out of a sincerely held cultural fear. So my proposed solution is really rooted in community education, what I sometimes call attacking the conceptual weakness, teaching about basic medical realities, explaining the difference between, say, cataracts and evil eyes, or the natural progression of memory loss that comes with aging. That can directly reduce superstition. It eliminates the very source material used to justify the initial, often deadly accusation. We have to debunk the evidence before we can effectively disarm the weapon.
That's an interesting point about the evidence base, the physical science. But I'm still convinced that the motivation driving the actual act of accusation is predominantly material and strategic. Look, if this were purely about genuine, sort of random supernatural fear, wouldn't we expect a wider distribution of victims across different ages, genders? But the pattern is just too consistent. The target is almost always the vulnerable elder, often a woman who owns property, particularly widows without male heirs to defend their claims. This isn't just about cultural fear. It feels like cynical manipulation. The accuser waits for a community misfortune, a drought, a sickness, whatever, and then strategically deploys the accusation against the vulnerable property owner. Why? To facilitate the seizure of assets. If land titling laws were properly enforced, and if police immediately intervened and investigated any resulting murder, let's call it the ROI, the return on impunity of that accusation, drops to zero. Regardless of what the accuser privately believes, we have to prioritize securing the life and property of the victim first, thereby neutralizing the strategic incentive.
I'm sorry, I just don't quite buy that the manipulation is primary. The very definition of an easy target, as you put it, it relies on communal belief. Yes, okay, the motivation of a specific relative might be land theft, fine. But for that theft to succeed through mob justice, the community has to interpret witchcraft literally. They have to view the potential victim as genuinely dangerous, as deserving of violence. If that cultural acceptance didn't exist, if people didn't interpret those specific physical and mental changes as supernatural evidence, well, the economic opportunists would have no credible justification. The mob wouldn't form, or certainly wouldn't act with such conviction. The fear, I think, is the fuel. The economic gain is maybe the engine, but it needs the fuel. And the focus on aging women as easy targets is absolutely rooted in that deep-seated cultural fear of the aging, changing female body. We have to change that core conceptual framework first, or the opportunistic violence will simply find another equally accessible justification. Or worse, the violence might just continue regardless of any new legal protections on paper. And we have direct evidence of the limits of a purely legal first approach if we look at Ghana's experience. The Ghanaian government has, commendably, taken action to close those notorious witch camps, right? Where accused women have been exiled, sometimes for decades. That demonstrates a strong legal and structural commitment to reintegration. Yet, these efforts are continuously undermined by the host communities.
Right.
These communities are often completely unwilling to accept the women back. Or, if they are forced to return, the women just remain pariahs, perpetually vulnerable to being accused again. Why does this resistance happen? It happens because the community still literally believes these women are spiritually dangerous. That's direct, painful evidence that legal or structural changes, like shutting down an illegal camp, are just insufficient if the underlying cultural conviction about the woman's malevolence isn't dissolved. And that requires comprehensive education and, broader cultural shifts. The law can close a camp, sure, but it can't eradicate fear.
That is a powerful point regarding Ghana, definitely. But I might frame the comparative outcomes a bit differently, emphasizing the distinction between the two countries. Ghana's outcome, while completely unacceptable, is generally exile and displacement to a camp. Tanzania's outcome, as we've said, is often outright violent murder. Hundreds of deaths annually, treated with near total impunity. So in the Tanzanian context, the immediate priority must be establishing a functional legal system where perpetrators face swift, certain consequences. We're dealing with murder here, primarily, not just property disputes or exile. When the consequence of making a baseless accusation is effectively state-sanctioned impunity, and let's be clear, when law enforcement ignores hundreds of cases, that is effectively state-sanctioned impunity, then the lack of legal protection becomes a far greater facilitator of death than the belief system itself. The immediate goal has to be pure triage, ensuring that the weapon of accusation is immediately disarmed by making it carry an immense legal risk for the accuser and any mob. We have to prioritize securing human life before we can effectively address the conceptual weaknesses, however important they are long-term. And just to follow up on that, let's explore the mechanism of impunity in Tanzania. It's not just a philosophical lack of protection, it's a practical resource and governance failure. The police are often poorly resourced, they lack training, or maybe they're influenced by the same beliefs themselves, or perhaps they simply don't prioritize crimes against older, marginalized women. My argument is that this structural weakness is actually the most efficient place to intervene. Why? Because you can enforce a law, theoretically, faster than you can change 1,000 years of belief. Implementing special police task forces for these specific crimes, establishing immediate witness protection programs, these are concrete steps. They immediately raise the cost to the crime. That structural fix seems necessary for any subsequent cultural work to even matter, to have a safe space to happen.
I see the urgency of triage, I really do, and nobody disputes that murder has to be stopped immediately. But I am still stuck on this fact. If a prosecutor or a judge or even the police officer on the ground genuinely believes in the danger of the so-called witch, then even the best structural reforms might be circumvented or just weakly implemented. You can mandate training, sure, but if the officer fundamentally views himself as protecting the community from a genuine spiritual threat, he's unlikely to apply the law diligently, is he? Moreover, let's address the sequencing problem you touched on earlier. How do you financially empower a woman who is already dead or already exiled, like those women trying to reintegrate in Ghana? Your structural solution, it addresses the motive, the theft, quite well, but it doesn't seem to address the trigger, the fear based on misinterpretation. We have to attack the conceptual weakness, the community's willingness to interpret memory loss or, strange behavior as witchcraft. And that requires rigorous education, not just basic literacy, but health education, education about aging. That kind of cultural transformation starts to remove the accuser's ability to even designate the victim in the first place, rendering the economic incentive much harder, maybe impossible to act upon. And this is precisely why the material highlights that changing gender norms and community education must be undertaken with the same vigor as legal reform. When I talk about conceptual weakness, I mean the systemic failure to provide alternative, scientific explanations for common phenomena. We're essentially asking communities to abandon the only explanatory framework they might have for tragedy, whether it's crop failure or dementia. Education about common diseases of poverty, things like malaria or HIV, that reduces the need to blame a spiritual source. And that, in turn, removes the target selection mechanism we've been discussing.
I absolutely recognize that cultural change is the ultimate goal, the long-term solution. But focusing solely on the conceptual weakness first, it feels like it allows the immediate and deadly structural injustice to just persist. The solution, I think, must focus on the macro-level issues that create the vulnerability in the first place, the patriarchy that systematically undervalues women's lives and property, and the economic insecurity that creates these desperate incentives. Strengthening land rights, strengthening financial agency for older women that removes the core incentive and provides a tangible legal barrier. If we can establish the rule of law and accountability first, ensuring perpetrators actually face trial, then we can create an environment where those vital cultural shifts can actually take root and be effective. As long as murder is essentially free, the belief system will continue to be ruthlessly exploited by opportunists. Legal consequences have to be the fastest, most prioritized response, simply to stem the immediate flow of violence.
We definitely agree on the severity of the crisis,
But yes, we diverge on the first move, the priority. I still maintain that while legal enforcement is completely non-negotiable, the prioritization must